Good evening, everyone. My name is Dominic Green. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the Director of Programs and Faculty at Inclusive Communities. Welcome to tonight's AAPI Table Talk. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Native and Indigenous people who lived and took care of the land that most of us gather on tonight, that belong to the Umaha, Ponca, Pawnee, Oda, Missouri, Santee, Dakota Sioux, Kansas, Iowa, Cheyenne, and Winnebago people. We honor with gratitude and pay our respects to all Native and Indigenous people. Omaha Table Talks, or as we refer to them as OTTs, was initially recreated in Omaha in 2003 by the Social Justice Advisory Committee of Catholic Charities, Omaha. In 2012, Inclusive Communities acquired OTTs and shifted them to a larger public discussion over comfort food. Last spring, we partnered with the Nebraska Asian American Leadership Alliance to start the Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI, Table Talk series that is quarterly to have a more focused conversation around topics within the AAPI community for us all to grow and learn. Now, due to COVID-19, we did shift to holding these events over Zoom and still have them on that Zoom virtual platform, but welcome you to still have a snack, food, beverage, or something with you during tonight's discussion, as we are always looking forward to having these discussions over that comfort food. We always look forward to growing and getting better, and so invite you at the end of tonight's event to please fill out our evaluation, and that link will be provided in the chat towards the end. At this time, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Cox Communication, Lozier Foundation, and American Family Insurance for allowing and making sure that these events can still happen. And now I'm going to turn it over to Candace to cover some housekeeping.
Yes, hello everyone and welcome. I'm going to continue to share my screen here so I can show y'all a few of our housekeeping things that we need. My name is Candace Freeman, and I am the Programs and Curriculum Manager here at Inclusive Communities, and my pronouns are she, her. Just a few things I want to kind of outline and go over with y'all first. We will be recording this conversation. I'm sure you heard that little recording. I do want to let you know that we are only recording the large panel portion and the share up portion. The time that y'all will be with in your table groups having individualized discussions, we will not record that piece, but I do want to make you all aware. If you feel uncomfortable being on camera or just don't simply want to be recorded, that's cool. Just go ahead and turn your camera off at this time. I do want to take a second to acknowledge all of the IC staff and volunteers that are going to be here and table facilitators trying to help us out today as we are moving through this conversation. And I also want to acknowledge our ASL interpreter, Amber, as well as our Spanish interpreters, Cruz and Aubrey. If you need their services at any point in time today in the conversation or the breakout rooms, please just message Colin and we will make sure to get you matched up with whoever you need to make sure that you can really engage in this conversation to your fullest. We will have an auto closed captioning feature as well that will be enabled. So a few tips due to the Spanish interpretation. We do ask that when you are speaking or talking, please take a second to speak clearly, take pauses, and keep a consistent pace. Since we do have an interpretation happening in Spanish, there's a little bit of a lag, and that'll allow our translators to be able to accurately translate the information to the audience. I will post the run through of the timeline in the chat so y'all know kind of what'll happen today, and you'll be good to go. Dominic?
Awesome.
I believe that's it.
Yeah. Well, without further ado, then I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for tonight's conversation and let her introduce the panelists. Yoon, thank you very much for agreeing to moderate.
Thanks, Dominic, for the warm welcome. Glad to have everyone here. So my name is Saksena. I'm moderating. We have wonderful panelists, which you maybe read about on the Facebook. Always go to Facebook for or other places to find out more about inclusive communities. It's a great resource. So I look Asian, but I sound Australian, and I'm from a Pacific island, but Australian does not. I don't count as the PI part of the AAPI. So this is about you're going to be learning from people who are part of that community, or they may not identify that, but they can help enlighten us, and so we can learn together what this means. So we called this thing, who are the PI folks? We're learning more about that as part of the AAPI community. So for introductions, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves. Let's start with Calli.
Hi, I'm Calli. My pronouns are she, her. I was born and raised, I'm a 4th generation Japanese, and I was born and raised on Oahu, Hawaii. And I moved to Nebraska in '98 for school and graduated and stayed here, got married, now have a son, and I'm currently working here in Nebraska.
Well, that's quite an adventure. I'm glad you're here. And then what about you, Pernes?
Hi, everyone. My name is Pernes, and I do identify as a Pacific Islander. Furthermore, from Micronesia. My country is Federated States of Micronesia, and my island is called Pohnpei. I moved to Nebraska in 2018 for school, like Calli. I went to UNO, and I just recently received my bachelor's from UNO back in 2020. And I work here at a local agency, insurance agency, and I enjoy spending time with my girlfriend and my little puppy.
Oh, glad that you stayed after college and school. Wow. Yeah. Much colder than where you grew up, I'm sure. Well, what about you, Maka?
Hi, everyone. My name is Maka. I am originally from Honolulu, Hawaii. I moved here not much longer after Calli in 1999. Went to school, graduated, fortunately, met my husband. Now I have 2 great kids who are also insane, but they are my joy as well. And I currently work in one of the public school districts here in town. So it's been a wild ride for the better part of 20 years.
Well, keep doing it. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we've got some questions for the panelists, and you can just take turns, jump in as you need or feel like it. I know people make assumptions about our identities. Doesn't matter what background you're from. So specifically for our panelists, what are some assumptions that people have placed on you regarding your identity?
Okay, this is Maka again, everyone. Something that's really not a major thing, and it's easy if you understand that people don't know much about Pacific Islanders. I get confused for Hispanic a lot, like I'm a member of the Latinx community. I'm not. I've even been told that I could pass as Puerto Rican, which I think Puerto Ricans are beautiful, just like Latin American women. I think they're absolutely stunning. But that's one assumption, is that I'm not actually Kanaka Maoli, is that I'm of a different culture. And when you understand that people maybe don't have the exposure to Pacific Island cultures, then I think it's easy to make that mistake. But I was even really fortunate to be told that my name Maka in a Native American language actually means, or actually is the word for earth, Mother Earth. And I said, I'm okay with that. I'm completely okay with that. So I'm learning, as people are learning, that I'm not what they think I am. And it's a great learning experience for me to learn about what they think I am. So it's been a pretty interesting opportunity when you look at it that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. But at the same time, you could see that they may not have had much experience with Pacific Islanders because you're pretty far from the Pacific Islands here.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What about one of the other two? What assumptions people made?
Right. I agree. That's the main assumption is me being mistaken as a Latino. But I've even gotten somebody thought I was from India too. And I guess it was because of what I was wearing, it has some colors and all that. And, I went into a store and, the cashier had asked me if I was, Indian. And I said, no, I'm Pacific Islander. I'm from Micronesia. And, that of course opens up a whole can of worms where I have to explain where that is. And, even saying Pacific Islander is not enough. Someone even asked me, is that like near Burma? And I said, no, that's near Hawaii and near Guam. It's actually right in the middle of those two, a US state and a US territory, which is Guam. So, these are some assumptions that I've experienced in my time being in the mainland.
Yeah, you're teaching us about geography. Thank you. Yeah, what about you, Calli? You've been mistaken for Hispanic too?
No. Maka's laughing. No, I haven't. No one's really identified me other than Asian, I guess. So I really don't have anything to contribute to this one. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. All right. Well, what are some stereotypes or misconceptions of the PI folks? And what have you folks done to debunk them if that's happened to you?
Well, that I can contribute to a little bit too. So people usually ask me where I'm from, and I tell them from Hawaii, and they ask me if I'm like of native Hawaiian blood, and I'm like, no. So that's really the only thing that I've had happen, or someone has asked me. So then I explain to them that I'm Japanese and that I'm Asian, and that I don't have native Hawaiian blood. And people are very open to it once you explain it to them. And I feel like it's an open communication, which is really nice.
That's good. You can have some good conversations that way.
Oh, definitely.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Pernes?
I've had a lot of instances actually, but it's hard to explain where I'm from without actually telling people where, the geography of it. I sometimes would say I'm an islander, and the first thing that they go to is, are you Hawaiian? And I tell them, no, I'm not Hawaiian. It's close to it. You're close, but not there yet. So, and then I say Micronesian, and people have no idea what that even means. And so, I usually get questions like, well, where the heck is that? And so I always have to explain and tell people it's in the middle of Hawaii and Guam. It's right in the middle. It's a small island. Even if you go on Google and try to look up my island, you wouldn't be able to see it until you zoom into it, and then you're gonna see a little dot on the map, and that's actually where I'm from. And it's and then people would ask me, well, do you know everybody on the island? Well, no. And so, those are some of the stuff that I've experienced. I've even, gone to the post office and try to send some packages back home, and people have a hard time placing or hard time finding where I need to send this to. And so I would, explain it to them, even show them my passport, and they just don't know where that is because and a lot of people, it's interesting because a lot of people would say that, oh, well, that's domestic, that's part of the US. It's not part of the US. It's it's a separate country on its own. And one of the things that I have a hard time, getting is my driver's license, because again, with the same thing, they don't know where I'm from and if my country even exists. So for 2 years in a row in Nebraska, I've always gotten the temporary driver's license until recently I had to contact our US embassy here and then, get some documentation sent to me so that I can prove that I'm Micronesian and that I'm able to get my driver's license. And that's what allowed me to get my 5-year driver's license.
Wow, that's really sad. Yeah. Gosh, yeah. That's I'm sure many people wouldn't even have thought that would happen to anyone. Wow, I'm just thinking, like, sometimes as a minority, you scroll down the list of things and then you're the other. And I'd hope that Micronesia is actually listed as a country, not under other.
Yeah.
Yun, it's funny that you mentioned that, because growing up in Hawaii, the high school that I went to was specifically created for Native Hawaiian people. And for a lot of people outside of the Pacific Islander community, but belonging to the United States, they don't realize that Hawaii is the US's only monarchy, that there was a lot of political turmoil in order to acquire Hawaii as a state. And so some of the things that a lot of Native Hawaiian people run into is that, well, some of the stereotypes that we run into. Oh, what do you mean you don't like pineapple or coconut? Two things that I don't actually enjoy eating as a Native Hawaiian. The experiences thus far have been, if I don't eat pineapple, like coconut, or know how to surf, can I really be Pacific Islander? Rochelle, I see your comment. Yes, I'm a big Kamehameha student, proud alumnus, all of that. But yeah, this is one of the stereotypes, some of the stereotypes. Educating people on Hawaii's history, or even how Pacific Islander encompasses more than just Hawaii, American Samoa, Tonga, Tahiti, Fiji, all of that, to include Micro and Melanesia, has been eye-opening. If you can have a conversation with people who are willing to learn, I don't know, Pernes, if you've had this experience at all, but if you can have that conversation and people do learn something and are open to taking away information, my relationships have been fostered better with people like that. And debunking things in this day and age is super difficult, especially with fads and trends, specifically concerning food. Everybody knows poke is now like this Hawaiian thing. I've been eating it my whole life, so I don't think anything of it. But that's also something that's making its way into the fabric of stereotypical island fare.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like I've been accused of not being Australian because I don't like beer.
That's terrible.
Some people don't have open minds, and then I just remember, like, Pernes, like thinking about your dot on the map, and people thinking that you know everyone there. I've been asked that about Australia too. It's like, oh, my cousin lives there. It's like, no, I don't know your cousin.
Nor do you, I don't think people realize that it's a lot bigger than it seems, not just Hawaii or Micronesia or Melanesia or any other Pacific island, but anywhere in the world. I relate to that question a lot. The other one is, why did you move? Why did you leave? How, my favorite in college was, how did you get here? I loved that
Good
question.
time.
That was my favorite question. How did you get here?
I
Probably the
get
same
that
way
too.
you did.
I get that too. And it's like, I'm not from a little island. I'm from a big island. Yeah, I flew.
Yeah.
Why am I here? Why are you here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Maka, I'm really glad that you mentioned like some of the smaller islands that people aren't so familiar with. Because it's true, like when people think about Pacific Island, they think Australia, they might think Hawaii, and then they don't think about anything smaller, or it's like, oh, I've never heard of that place. You sure? It's like, yeah, I'm from there, So then let's talk a little bit about debunking some of like the disaggregating data, because that's what you're talking about pretty much. When everyone just kind of lumps you all together, like you're from the Pacific Islands, therefore you must be Hawaiian, or you must know how to surf and like pineapples. So let's delve into that a little bit more about why it's important to disaggregate data. Who wants to speak up about that?
I think I can, but it's a little different than, I think disaggregating data is very important, or separating out, making subgroups, because then you can identify, make relationships, evaluate the information. I'm more a scientific mind, as you can see. So I have a medical background. So therefore, when I think of separating groups out, I think of, as you probably have heard, people are races, people with different races. Sorry, I think I'm talking really fast. People with different races are predisposed to certain disease states. And being that Asian American or AAPI, that's a really huge group that you're talking about. You're talking about not only Asians, but Pacific Islanders that have different genetics. And so being able to split that or divide or subgroup those in, or group them in different ways, you can identify different ways to treat people. With the advances of medicine today, we can obviously, it's easier to treat people. Medicine is moving towards treating based on genetics. And so again, backing towards genes and race and things like that will also help with, separating that information out and gathering the data. That way you can better treat people.
That's so important. Yeah, thank you.
I agree. I like that you brought up that idea, because, it is true. People are raised, especially if you're a part of a ethnic group, you're raised differently. Your lifestyle, your family, it's just everybody, all the different ethnicities and races are raised differently, and so they're gonna have, different diseases that they're more susceptible to, and so it's absolutely important that we need to disintegrate the data, and that way we can identify what kind of medicine to provide to these specific groups. So from the medical background, I think that's very important that we identify the different groups. But not only that, but when it comes to sometimes people might want to become U.S. citizens, and so one of the things that I know a lot of people from where I'm from back home, is they serve in the military, and a lot of them might be lumped together as just Pacific Islanders. And I know a lot of my friends, a lot of my classmates within the same age group as me, they're serving in the military, and so when they go do their paperwork, I just, what did they even put down? Is it other, or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander? Because currently that's the only option that we have. we don't have anything other than that. And so I think if we have a place, then we can sort of identify ourselves, and we will be able to see all the data and see the numbers of how many people are serving in the military.
Yeah, and making important contributions too. Yeah, Maka, we're talking about disaggregating data. What are your
Yes,
thoughts
ma'am.
about that?
I think it's important. I think it's necessary. Being a part of the Asian American Pacific Islander community is fantastic. But from a social construct standpoint, I think I, to this day, will still check other and write in Native Hawaiian. Not because there isn't a spot for me to check, but because it's important for people to know that that is how I identify. Kind of like what Pernes said, I would love to see Micronesian, Melanesian, Tongan, Chinese, Hmong, Vietnamese. I think that would be a great place to start showing representation in the community. When I was in high school, we were instructed, there was Asian Pacific Islander. That was an option for us when we were filling out our FAFSAs or learning how to do all of that kind of stuff. But we were instructed by our school counselors to check other and then write in what we were, because we wanted that representation. We didn't have Asian Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian. We only had AAPI. So I'm gonna date myself, in the 25 years that I've been out of high school, that has been added to the census so that we can say Native Hawaiian. And that's kind of a cool thing. And I think that if, socially speaking, if we were to do that, if each ethnic community wanted to do that, they could identify, you could get the US Census to say, we have Micronesians in our communities, and here's where they're mostly living. They do that for every other group. So why not be seen, be heard, be the squeaky wheel? I think that's really important.
I'm glad you raised that point, Maka. I mean, that and recognizing and being proud of your identity too.
Absolutely.
Versus just kind of lumped into other, being able to distinguish yourself. But then with the census, I know that they use that data to think about distribution of resources. So if you're not seen, then you're not going to get the resources, because they think, oh, the Asians, they're all good, AAPI, they're all good. And then meanwhile, it's the majority that dictates what everyone else is getting.
Exactly.
I remember being in saying I had to try to figure out what to check off. I mean, I look Asian, but I'm Australian. Right? I'd say I'm Australian. And it goes, what? How can you be Australian? I didn't look like that. And I actually went to there was a medical form I was filling out, and there was no place for me. I had to check other, because the option was Asian American. It's like, no, that's not me. Right. Yeah. So what about the others? What do you check off? How do you self-identify when you have to fill out these forms? So Maka has the other and then writes in Native Hawaiian. What about you, Calli?
I usually check Asian just because it's a box. I truly do identify myself as Japanese though. Like, I never thought to check other. So this is like a learning experience for me to check other and put Japanese on there. There are some forms that contain Japanese, but most of them, they're just Asian.
Yeah, and it's really different because I'm genetically Chinese.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I like that idea about checking off other and then putting Chinese or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. My kids are mixed and they check off whatever they feel like on the day.
Yeah.
What about you, Pernes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna start doing that, checking off other, and then putting down Micronesian. But sometimes on forms it doesn't even have other. So the only option for me is Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, because I've recently I filled out 2 forms to get tested for the COVID-19, and those are the only options. And so for me, that's the closest thing. So I check that off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can understand why people do that though too, because it's easier for data collection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when they have to analyze data. Yeah, because otherwise it'd be
I'm gonna-
millions of these others.
I think right now, if they don't have other, I'm gonna write in other and then write my ethnicity.
There's a little bit of self-empowerment to that too, you know. It's, I'm not fitting into one of your boxes. I'm multi-ethnic and I identify as Kanaka Maoli, which is how Hawaiians identify each other as natives. Um, and I also identify as Nikkei, which is a person of Japanese heritage raised outside of Japan. My third is Filipino. So I can, I find that it's really empowering to be able to write down those three things specifically. And then people will look at it and say, well, what is this? What do we do with this? That's a great learning opportunity for you to figure out those things.
Yeah, that's not your problem. That's their problem. But with I like how Calli, how you mentioned about the medical side of things in healthcare, because I was just kind of looking at desegregating data, and COVID's affecting all communities, but people probably don't know that in California, where there is like a really large PI population, like one of the second largest in the world aside from in the Pacific Islands, that they don't disaggregate data. But then in one survey, I think they did, and they found out that out of the PI group, it's the Native Hawaiians that got hit the worst with COVID. And when you're talking about the multi-generation homes.
Yes.
Right? So people wouldn't know that otherwise. Yeah. We have a few more minutes. We've got a few more questions we can get through. And even if we don't, we have a great discussion. So what were you taught about your culture? And yeah, what were you taught about your culture?
So I was taught growing up that we be very obedient to like our elders, and we kind of just blended in. We never stood out or kind of shied away from attracting attention to ourselves. So, you know, pretty strict growing up. I think that's, I can't speak for everyone, but I feel like that's like a traditional Japanese household.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
thanks.
I mean, about my culture, because my ancestors, they migrated from Southeast Asia and came to the islands and started building a life there. So we have a lot of similarities with Asian, mostly Japanese, and not only that, but our islands were conquered by several groups of back in the past. It was first there was the Germans that came and took control of our islands, and then we had no wait it was Spanish first. The Spaniards came in, and then the Germans, and then U.S. came in. Well, before that it was the Japanese, and so the Japanese, and then U.S. came in and liberated our islands. Is what the textbooks would say. And so, there's just a multicultural background to, everybody in the islands, but, it's kind of hard to explain, with me, how I identify as a Micronesian, as a Pohnpeian. Most of us would associate ourselves to the land, which is in a way similar to Native Hawaiians, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe Maka can speak more on that. But as a Micronesian, that's mainly where we draw our identity to, and that's to the land.
What about you, Maka?
So I'm kind of a double-sided coin. I was raised in a Japanese household, but because I went to Kamehameha, I got as much immersion without being immersed in Hawaiian culture. What a lot of people don't realize is that Kamehameha is actually a Protestant school. So we had church every week and we did all of that, regardless of whether or not you're Protestant. Actually, the majority of the population at Kamehameha are Mormon, which is great. Hawaii is super diverse from ethnic backgrounds to religious practices. There's all kinds of things. But I grew up very Japanese. I left that, what Calli was talking about, not drawing attention to yourself, being very in line. I deviated probably in high school. I got to know who I am. Culturally speaking, Japanese culture definitely steers my path a lot of the time. And then the Hawaiian culture kind of balances it out. Pernes isn't wrong. There's a lot of ties to the land and the ocean in Hawaiian culture. Spirituality is all about the land and the ocean. So when I tell people I really appreciate your energy, that's my Hawaiian culture coming out in a way that non-Hawaiians can understand, because everybody understands energy in some way, shape, or form. But language, I would say, is probably the most important thing that I learned. I can understand Japanese really, really well, whether or not I can't speak it at all. But if someone were to talk to me in Japanese, I'm pretty okay at it. I wouldn't completely butcher everything. And then I can read, write, and I haven't spoken in a very long time, but I was able to speak Hawaiian at one point. So my two boys, both learning vocabulary in English, Japanese, Hawaiian. And because I'm a glutton for punishment, we're also trying to learn Mandarin together.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful, though, what you told us, shared with us about the culture. I want to learn more. We want to have time for breakout groups. So maybe we can continue this conversation after that. I'm going to hand over to Dominic now.
Thank you.
Actually, we switched it up on you.
Yep.
Sorry, we switched it up on you, so it'll actually be me. So thanks all of y'all, Yoon, Calli, Pernes, and Maka. We appreciate your insight and all of your awesomeness. I really enjoyed learning from y'all, and I'm sure everybody else in the room did as well. There are just a few things that I want to outline with the full room here before we go into our breakout room portion. Let me share my screen again. All right. We just have a few breakout room agreements, community agreements. We just kind of consolidated them into one that I wanted to briefly go over with all of you before you are sent out into your breakout rooms to kind of have some individualized conversations. In each breakout room, there will be a table facilitator that will help facilitate the conversation with y'all. So in that time, when you are having that conversation together, please designate a speaker. This is one thing I always forget to say, but please designate a speaker in that space. So when we do come back to the full group, you can share 1 to 2 moments of enlightenment that you all had discussed in your individual groups. So for our agreements here, 1 speaker, 1 mic. We are on Zoom, so it's awesome. 2 people can't speak at once, so it kind of does itself. Just be respectful of people when they are speaking. Make space, take space. Make sure that everyone is getting an adequate amount of airtime to share their thoughts, share their insight, or share their feedback. Accept and expect non-closure. Know that this is just the starting conversation. These are the building blocks to frame yourself into having a larger conversation. Sorry, let me go back there. Open your mind to curiosity. I'm sure you are all like myself. I'm learning a lot of new things. So just keep your mind open to, let's say, absorbing all of that knowledge and awesomeness. Speak your truth. When you are speaking, we ask that you please speak from your own experience, your own voice, the use of I statements, and trying to not overgeneralize or basically just lump a one group together. And then last, Vegas twist. In these spaces, as I've already outlined, they will not be recorded. This is the time for y'all to kind of have your own individual conversation. But with that, we do ask to keep an element of privacy. We want you to take those awesome stories or lessons that are learned in that space. But we ask that you please ask consent if someone shares something personal, or just leave that there with y'all. Take the learning with you, but keep that privacy piece a little bit separate as something that you all shared in your breakout rooms together. So at this time, if you need any of the translation services, please just let us know. I know that they've put it in the chat a few times here, but if you do need anything, or if you have 2 devices, just go ahead and drop it in before we send you out. Colin, I think they're good to go. If you want to send them out into breakout rooms, do not forget, remember, please designate that speaker so we can hear all the awesomeness that y'all talked about in your breakout rooms.
Welcome back, everyone. And at this point, we like to hear from you all as to what were some of the things that you all discussed and talked about and shared in your breakout rooms. So if I could have the volunteer from Joanna's room share with us what were some of the key, like 1 or 2 key takeaways that you all talked about.
Yes, absolutely. I am sorry, Candace. I actually forgot to do my one job and ask one person to be the spokesperson for our group. So if anyone would like to jump in, please feel free.
You're not alone. Tina and I also do that all the time. It's fine.
Thank you.
So what were a couple of key takeaways that you all talked about?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. If anyone wants to jump in, please feel free. So some of the things that we talked about was that we thought that the expansion of identity in things like the census was incredibly empowering. One of our members actually took away that they were going to be elevating that conversation in her research groups and in the work that she does around health centers in town to make sure that their intake forms are more accurate and more representative of the community. We talked about how well-intended, curious questions can very much miss the mark and can be very alienating and othering when you're asked things like, where are you from? Or why did you leave? We shared vulnerabilities about biases and misconceptions that we've held and how we, checked our own assumptions about the PI community. We found that there were a lot of, we found it insightful that we thought about how many invisible barriers people face at the interpersonal level, and we reflected on how that could really affect large groups of people, like with the example that Pernes provided about the licensure. Another member shared a very intimate memory from where she had experienced something similar. We talked about how amazing it is that Maka was teaching her kids very intentionally about their own heritage, but also of others. We talked about diversity in the PI space, how awesome the panel was that was put together, and how we have to be also cognizant about the way that we identify people, because we can self-identify despite heritage and our background. We identify who we are and the cultural heritage that we align with. Some takeaways were to go back to the definition of AAPI and revisit the communities and the history. A very beautiful, I'm going to butcher it. So Maka, do you want to actually jump in to say the beautiful, the differences and the commonalities quote?
Sure. We were talking about how I was not aware that Micronesia was considered or included in the definition of PI peoples. And I said that it made me curious, and I wanted to see, after Pernes talked about all of the colonization that occurred, I wanted to see where we were the same and where we were different, because the beauty that we have in each other is in the differences, but the relationship that we build is in our commonalities.
Yes, absolutely. I was telling her that needs to go on a shirt somewhere because that is snaps. We talked about, this one was really great. We talked about what really are better questions to get to know someone beyond where are you from and questions of that sort. We had a lot of really good individual takeaways. All in all, we had a really, really great breakout session. If anyone has anything to add from our group, please feel free.
Awesome. It sounds like y'all had a really great conversation, and I really that's awesome that one of your members and maybe more are already thinking of ways that they can take what they've learned from this conversation and already start to implement some change within their own system. And that's what we like to hear, is what are some of those action steps, because these conversations are, like Candace mentioned earlier, to start the conversation, and with the hope that you all are going to take what you've learned from this conversation and take it out to your own communities and your own environments, and to continue that learning and to continue to learn yourself as well. Thank you very much for sharing. Tina, what were a couple of takeaways from your all's conversation and what you all talked about?
Laura graciously agreed to be our spokesperson with 10 seconds on the clock. So thank you, Laura.
I don't have quite as an in-depth memory as Johanna does, but there was a fair amount of conversation amongst our participants about where the members of the team resonated with some of the comments that the panelists made, and then that led to some conversation about how important it is to recognize our individual heritages, and how Johanna, you said something about being othered. I think there was some, without using those words, conversation about feeling left out and in history class and things like that when your perspective wasn't represented. And then we got into some geography conversations about where is America Samoa. And then we talked a little bit about, again, similar to the other group, the diversity that falls under that umbrella of Pacific Islands. And I think that's about it. Awesome. If I missed anything, anyone let me know.
Well, thank you for sharing out. It also sounds like you all had a great conversation as well. So we do have a couple minutes. If anybody has a question that they would like to ask our panel here tonight, you can go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself, or type it into the chat, and I'll relay it to the panel. Yes, Elizabeth.
I am chock full of questions. So I'll just start out with one question. I do realize that history books are written by the winners, quote unquote winners, and the people who write them are usually people who haven't experienced the same history. How would you be able to find more accurate and in-depth information about Pacific Islander histories, their groups, and their cultures?
Great question. Any of our panelists ready to?
To direct you to Hawaiian history and Hawaiian culture, there is a place on Oahu called Bishop Museum. The Bishop Museum Press publishes books by Native authors, but also they publish books surrounding Hawaiian history. So you can actually learn a ton of stuff. I haven't looked at the sheet that was created as like a takeaway, but I know that there are, if you did like Hawaiian publication searches, there is a list that comes up from the Honolulu magazine that has great resources as well. I couldn't speak to you about other cultures, but Native Hawaiian, I got your back.
So before coming out to attend UNO, I went to University of Guam, and there's a lot of native Guamanians or Chamorro people that have written about Micronesia. And that's a good chunk of representation for all of us. And so if you go to their website, the University of Guam website, under library, you can find a lot of these books and written by professors and the native people on Guam.
Awesome, thank you. Calli, would you like to add anything? Just wanted to provide this space if you wanted to.
I appreciate it. I don't have anything. Maka's very knowledgeable about things that
Awesome.
I defer to her.
And I will say Candace has been putting in links to websites that have been mentioned, and those will also go out in the follow-up email that you all receive after this conversation tonight. Do we have one more question?
No, I just wanted to add, I think USC, University of Southern California, has a Pacific Asian Center, or there's something there where you can get some additional information.
Awesome. Yeah, and thank you, Sharon, for adding that. I know in the chat, Kip had asked, has there been a concerted effort to address a school board, I guess any school board really, to present teaching this very important history in schools? Do either of you know some information with that?
So in Hawaii, teaching Hawaiian history was specific to my high school. I don't know other high schools that taught it. When I came up for college here, I had to take another history class, non-Western US history. At the time, Hawaiian history was acceptable to fulfill that requirement. So I actually went home, did a summer school class, took more Hawaiian history, and that was okay. But those are the only places that I know that make it part of curriculum, where it's specific to the place that you're at. I don't know, Pernes, is it the same for you in Micronesia?
Back home, we learn our history and our language and how to read and write from first grade through third grade, and then from fourth through eighth and high school, we learn about English and then U.S. history and world history in general. So I learned a lot of different histories for U.S. and then Asia, and my own history and how we were colonized. So I think it's pretty much part of the curriculum back where I'm from.
Sure. And I know Kip was trying to get at, like, here within Omaha or in the mainland states, if anybody knows, if either of you know that, it hasn't been addressed. I can tell you from my own experience, I never really learned about anybody else's history except for our own and from a certain point of view, as we've mentioned as well. So go ahead, please.
Illinois and New Jersey are the only two states that have passed legislation at the state level to require AAPI history to be taught in the K-12 schools.
Wow.
And in Nebraska, I contacted my State Board of Education representative to find out whether that could be something that they could prescribe or suggest in terms of curriculum. And I was told that it would come under the social studies curriculum, which isn't up for renewal or revision for another year or two. But that should she stay on the state board, she and others would do what they can to make that happen. But as far as I know, there's been no legislation at the state level. And I don't know of any particular school boards either which have entertained a proposal to do so. I'm not aware. It's not to say there couldn't be, but I'm just not aware.
Thanks, Lorraine, for sharing that. Yes, and I know Chrissy put some information in the chat as well.
I think that's really interesting. But it also, that's the first step to get it in the curriculum. But the next one really is who's it taught by, because we think about things being whitewashed or only being told from the white perspective. Or when I think about Pernes and how many times they've been invaded, and I mean, who's telling the story, right? And I almost want to feel like there's that, we've got to talk to all these grandparents that are out there, all these elderly people who have that verbal history, and learn from them.
Absolutely.
I can also say that some experience I had with my Japanese American organization when we were trying to look at history to be included in the textbooks, in the K-12 social studies textbooks. It's very difficult to get new information into those. And what will sway the textbook companies is if the states that purchase large numbers of the textbooks require their districts to use specific textbooks, then they'll listen to what those states are saying needs to be in the textbook. So I remember as we were looking way back in terms of trying to get some additional Asian American and Japanese American history in, about the camps especially, we had to try to influence Texas and California, because they were the two largest states that had requirements for their districts to use specific textbooks. So those were the states that you had to influence to say what should go into a curriculum, and then the textbook company would put that in because they want those states to purchase their textbooks.
That's interesting that you mentioned the textbook side. I love one of my daughter's history teachers, because when you ask them what textbook did you use, he says, we don't use one. And he says, we go to the sources, we go to the papers, we go people referencing and talk to people, and that's how they learn their history. And it's like, I love you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sharon, for providing that helpful information as well. I hate to be the one that does this, but we are out of time. Time runs fast, as always, every time we meet. Candace is going to be sharing in the link, our link to our evaluation form in the chat. And again, just please encourage you all to click on that link once it's in there and provide us some feedback on how you feel like this conversation went tonight, what you like to see, some edits, any changes, any of that, those sort of things. And then also our next Omaha Table Talk, it will be Tuesday, February 8th. This will be an afternoon table talk from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. So over that noon time. And we'll be talking about what is the Crown Act and why is it important. So just pay attention to our social media pages or website for more information on that.
Can I add something to that?
Please go ahead.
So in the chat, there's also three things. So there's the evaluation, there's the short link to our next conversation, and then also there's that data sheet that we created to kind of help you use that as your tangible piece to kind of continue to explore your own learning. As Dominic mentioned, you also will all receive a follow-up email with all of the resources that were shared out tonight, and then a short synopsis of the conversation too. I do want to mention that our next Omaha Table Talk that link is referring to on February 8th, the might look a little different than how we traditionally do table talk, but we will it'll be a surprise. So I hope you come back to see it. Yeah, we'll stay with that conversation, but it's going to look a little different. So definitely come back to join in on that conversation and get registered as well. That's all I have. Dominic, if you have anything else to close us out.
No, that's great. Thank you, Candace, for sharing that. Again, I just encourage y'all to follow us on our website or social media, or sign up to receive our emails and newsletters. And we'll see you all next time when we meet. Thank you for being here.